She gave up her fortune to build the billionaire CEO's empire. You built half this empire. The world should know that. Elena stood in the doorway of her small studio apartment, paint-streaked jeans clinging to her frame, turpentine sharp in the air between them. David Bright held up a stack of legal papers, his hands trembling with something that looked like rage or shame or both. I didn't want revenge, she said, her voice steady as stone. I wanted peace. But peace doesn't erase what's true. True. He stepped closer, his designer shoes crossing the threshold she tried so hard to keep him outside of. You could have taken everything. Every building with my name on it. Every contract. Every patent. Why didn't you? Because taking from you wouldn't give me back what I lost. And what did you lose, Elena? She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw it. The absence where love used to live. The quiet exhaustion of a woman who had already mourned him while he was still breathing. Myself, she whispered. I lost myself building your dream. 5 years. 5 years since she'd walked out of Bright House of Design wearing no shoes, carrying nothing but a folded envelope. 5 years since he'd convinced himself that her silence meant forgiveness, that her absence meant she'd moved on. He'd been wrong about everything. The morning light spilled through the glass walls of the Bright House of Design, turning the marble floors to gold. Assistants moved in quiet choreography. Cameras flashed in the lobby. Journalists jostled for position near the velvet ropes that separated genius from the ordinary world. David Bright stood before the mirror in his private office, fastening his cufflinks like a man rehearsing calm. Each small movement was deliberate, practiced. The face that stared back at him from the reflection was the face the world had learned to worship. Sharp jawline, silver threading through dark hair at just the right temples. Eyes that could sell luxury with a single glance. He was at the height of everything he'd ever wanted. An empire of luxury lines stretched across 43 countries. His name was embossed on the sides of perfume bottles that sat on the vanities of celebrities and royalty. His portrait appeared in every business magazine worth reading, usually accompanied by words like visionary, revolutionary, self-made. Self-made. The word tasted like copper in his mouth. Behind the sleek glass walls and the minimalist furniture and the awards that lined his shelves like soldiers at attention, something in him twitched whenever silence fell. A phantom ache, a name he couldn't quite swallow. Today marked 10 years since his brand had gone public. 10 years since Bright became synonymous with elegance, with aspiration, with the kind of beauty that only money could buy. The anniversary gala would bring politicians, artists, royalty. 500 guests dressed in clothes that cost more than most people earned in a year, all gathered to celebrate him. And yet, as he buttoned his jacket, as he adjusted his tie, as he prepared to walk into that ballroom and accept their adoration, he found himself whispering the same forbidden name. Elena. Her name slipped out like an ache he couldn't cauterize. He hadn't spoken to her in 5 years, not since the day she walked out of this same building wearing no shoes, carrying nothing but a folded envelope. He still remembered the sound her bare feet made on the marble. Soft, final, like a period at the end of a sentence he hadn't finished reading. He still remembered the smear of dust on the marble where she dropped her ring. His assistant had cleaned it within minutes, but sometimes, late at night when the building was empty, he swore he could still see the outline. A ghost mark. A scar the world couldn't see. His phone buzzed. His PR director, Vanessa Hartley, efficient and ruthless in equal measure. 30 minutes, Mr. Bright. The press is ready for your entrance. Understood. He set the phone down and looked at the empty chair beside his desk. Cream leather. Ergonomic. Expensive. It had been Elena's once. She used to sit there with her legs tucked under her, sketching designs on napkins, on the backs of receipts, on anything she could find. Her handwriting was terrible, but her vision was flawless. Elena should have been here, he thought. The words formed before he could stop them. He almost laughed at the absurdity. She had vanished, left no forwarding address, no lawsuit, no angry press conference. She'd taken nothing. When the auditors had confirmed that all her shares had been transferred to him before she disappeared, He told himself it was her final gift, her way of cutting ties cleanly. But sometimes, in the quiet moments he couldn't fill with meetings or appearances or deals, guilt whispered darker things. That she hadn't left, that he'd driven her away, that every success he celebrated was built on the bones of what they'd destroyed together. 12 years earlier, Elena Warren had been the daughter of an art school dean, born into quiet fortune, raised in the echo of piano keys and oil paint and the kind of privilege that didn't need to announce itself. Her childhood home had smelled like linseed and old books. Her trust fund was modest by billionaire standards but comfortable enough that she never had to worry about rent or groceries or whether her art would sell. When she met David Bright, he was nobody. A struggling designer with calloused hands and big, impossible ideas. He worked 3 jobs to afford fabric samples. He slept on his friend's couch. He wore the same jacket to every meeting because it was the only one without holes. But Elena saw something in him. Hunger. The kind that could move mountains or destroy itself trying. She saw the spark that everyone else dismissed as delusion. They met at a gallery opening. He'd crashed it, actually, slipping past security with a borrowed invitation and a confidence he didn't feel. She'd been standing in front of a painting, a massive canvas of fractured light, when he'd made the mistake of offering his opinion. The composition is derivative, he'd said, trying to sound sophisticated. Rothko without the emotional depth. She turned to him, eyebrows raised, amusement dancing in her eyes. Is that so? Obviously. Anyone with basic training can see it. Well, she'd said, extending her hand.
I'm Elena Warren.
I painted it. He'd wanted to die on the spot. Instead, he'd laughed. A real laugh, not the practice chuckle he used in meetings. And she'd laughed too. And somehow they'd ended up talking until the gallery closed and the security guard had to politely ask them to leave. 3 months later, she'd invested her entire inheritance into his dream, against every warning from her father, against the advice of financial advisors who called him a risk, against common sense and market research and every rational reason to walk away. She believed in him with a ferocity that terrified him. Her connections introduced him to patrons. Her eye for design refined his rough sketches into something elegant. She designed the first campaign that made Bright a name whispered in high-end circles. The tagline had been hers too. Luxury is not what you own. It's what you become. They were a team that burned bright. At night, they planned in coffee-stained notebooks, their handwriting bleeding together until neither could remember whose idea was whose. At dawn, they argued about shades of ivory and ash gray, about whether silk or satin better captured longing, about whether beauty should comfort or challenge. When the first boutique opened on a quiet street corner in Manhattan, barely 600 square feet of space, he'd lifted her in his arms and spun her around while she laughed. Passersby had smiled at the young couple so clearly in love. It's ours, Elena, he'd whispered against her hair. Always ours. Back then, she believed him. The Bright House of Design grew faster than anyone predicted. What started as a single boutique became 3, then 7, then 20. Investors circled like sharks sensing blood in the water. Department stores begged to carry his lines. Fashion magazines declared him the next great American designer. But success had a way of sharpening David into someone harder. The more the company grew, the more he demanded perfection. Not just from his employees, but from himself. From Elena. She'd been his partner once. Equal in every decision. But as the empire expanded, as the pressure mounted, as the stakes grew higher, he began editing her designs without asking. Overruling her opinions in meetings. Introducing her to investors as his muse instead of his business partner. You don't understand scale. He'd snapped once during a presentation to a potential manufacturer. Elena had suggested a more sustainable fabric source, something that would cost more but align with their original vision. Leave the business to people who do. The room had gone silent. The investors had looked uncomfortable. Elena had simply closed her notebook, smiled politely, and excused herself. Later, he'd found her in their apartment, packing a bag. What are you doing? He'd asked. The empire you're building, David? she'd said, folding a sweater with careful precision. It's losing its soul. Soul doesn't sell. She'd stopped then, looked at him with something that might have been pity.
No.
But it's the only thing worth keeping. That was the first time she'd tried to leave. He'd begged her to stay, promised change, whispered apologies against her neck until dawn broke through their bedroom window. He'd meant every word in that moment, believed with his whole heart that he could be better. She'd stayed, not out of weakness but hope. Hope that the man she'd fallen in love with was still somewhere inside the empire they'd built. Hope that success hadn't completely consumed the dreamer who'd crashed a gallery opening just to see art. Hope, as it turned out, was the cruelest designer of all. The years blurred together. More boutiques, more investors, more compromises that felt necessary at the time but left marks neither of them acknowledged. Elena's name slowly disappeared from company documents. First from the masthead, then from the creative credits, finally from the board roster. It's just cleaner this way, David had explained when the lawyers recommended consolidating ownership. Simpler for the IPO. You'll still have input on everything. But input wasn't ownership. And input became suggestion. And suggestion became silence. She stopped attending meetings, stopped designing, spent more time in their apartment, painting again like she used to before Bright existed. Her canvases grew darker, abstracts that looked like beautiful things falling apart. David told himself she was finding her own creative outlet, that this was healthy, that every couple needed space to grow individually. He didn't see her disappearing until she was already gone. Now, standing in his office, staring at the empty chair, he wondered how he'd been so blind. How he'd convinced himself that everything was fine even as she faded into background noise. Even as her laughter stopped echoing through their home. Even as the light in her eyes dimmed until she looked at him like a stranger. His phone buzzed again. Vanessa. 20 minutes, Mr. Bright. The first wave of guests is arriving. On my way. He straightened his tie one final time and walked toward the door. Toward the cameras and the champagne and the celebration of an empire built on a foundation he'd tried very hard to forget. 2 hours before the gala reached its peak. Before the speeches and the toasts and the carefully choreographed moment when he would thank everyone except the one person who deserved it most, David's assistant entered his office with a cream-colored envelope. Marcus Wu had been with him for 3 years. Efficient, discreet, never asked questions David didn't want to answer. But now Marcus looked uncertain. The envelope held between his fingers like something dangerous. This just arrived by courier, sir. No return address. The delivery person insisted it was urgent. David took the envelope. Heavy cardstock. Expensive. The kind of paper Elena used to source for their first invitations back when they couldn't afford proper printing. The handwriting on the front made his stomach tighten. A looping, elegant script he would recognize anywhere. His name written in ink that might have been charcoal or might have been smoke. David Bright. Not Mr. Bright. Not CEO. Just his name, the way she used to say it in the morning when sunlight made her hair look like copper wire. Thank you, Marcus. That will be all. Marcus nodded and left, closing the door with a soft click. David stood alone in his office, the envelope feeling heavier than it should. He'd spent 5 years building walls against this moment. 5 years convincing himself that Elena Warren was a chapter he'd closed cleanly, that her silence meant she'd moved on, that he could celebrate his success without acknowledging the cost. His hands shook slightly as he opened the envelope. Inside, a single invitation card embossed with gold foil, the kind of printing that cost a fortune because every letter was pressed by hand, because quality mattered more than speed. She taught him that. Exhibit opening. Hands that build and break. By E. Warren. Venue. The Orchid Gallery. 8 p.m. Tonight. The same night as his gala. The same hour he was supposed to give his anniversary speech. The same moment he was supposed to stand before 500 people and accept their worship for an empire he'd built on her bones. He stared at the initials. A. Warren. She'd gone back to her family name. Stripped away the years they'd spent as partners, as lovers, as two people who'd believed they could build something beautiful together. She'd returned. and she'd chosen this night deliberately. David set the invitation on his desk and walked to the window. Below, Manhattan glittered like a circuit board, all light and motion and commerce that never slept. Somewhere in that sprawl of glass and steel, Elena Warren was preparing to show the world what she'd created from the wreckage of their dream. He should stay. The gala was crucial. Investors were expecting his speech. The board had spent months planning this event. Walking out would raise questions he couldn't answer, but his hand was already reaching for his phone. His thumb was already pulling up the address for the Orchid Gallery. 10 minutes away. He could make it there and back before anyone noticed he was gone. He was lying to himself and he knew it. 5 years earlier, the final fight had erupted under the same chandeliers that now gleamed over his empire. The company was preparing to go public. Investors wanted Elena's voting rights transferred to consolidate control, to simplify the ownership structure, to remove complications. David had convinced himself it was pragmatic. Smart business. He'd even told her it was temporary, just until the IPO settled, just until they established stable trading, just until everything calmed down. "I need you to sign these," he'd said, sliding the documents across their dining room table, the same table where they'd once planned their first collection, where they'd celebrated their first profit, where she'd cried happy tears when the New York Times had called their debut show transcendent. Elena had read every page, slowly, carefully, while he'd paced and checked his phone and mentally calculated how much time they were wasting. "This transfers all my shares to you," she'd said finally. "It's temporary. It says permanent transfer of ownership rights." The lawyers had to word it that way for legal reasons. "You know how these things work." She'd looked up at him then, really looked, like she was trying to memorize his face, or maybe trying to find someone she used to know. "Do I?" she'd asked. "Know how these things work?" "Elena, we don't have time for philosophy. The deadline is tomorrow morning. If we don't file these documents, we miss our window. Everything we've built falls apart. Everything you've built." The correction had been quiet, not angry, just accurate, and somehow that made it worse. "That's not fair," he'd said. "This is our company." "Is it?" She'd picked up a pen. "When was the last time you asked my opinion on a design? When was the last time my name appeared on anything we released? When was the last time you introduced me as anything other than your muse? You're more than that. Then why doesn't the paperwork say so?" He'd had answers, good answers, about optics and marketing and how investors preferred clear leadership structures, about how her name on official documents might complicate their personal relationship, about how this was protecting both of them. All lies dressed in business casual. She'd signed each page, her signature growing smaller as she went, like she was disappearing even as she wrote her own name. When she'd set down the pen, she'd said quietly, "I hope you never forget whose hands built your dream." He'd been annoyed by the dramatics, frustrated by her inability to see the bigger picture. Dreams don't belong to the people who watch. They belong to the ones who finish them. He'd watched her face close, watched something essential leave her eyes. She'd stood, walked to their bedroom and closed the door. He'd told himself she was being emotional, that she'd understand eventually, that success required sacrifice and she was smart enough to see that. The next morning she was gone. No note. No explanation. Just absence. Her clothes still in the closet. Her paintings still on the walls. But her essence, the thing that made their apartment feel like home, vanished like smoke. He'd tried calling, texting, sending emails that grew increasingly desperate. But her phone went straight to voicemail. Her email bounced back. Her social media accounts disappeared. He'd hired investigators who found nothing. She'd simply erased herself from his life with the same precision she'd once used to design their first collection. When the auditors confirmed that she'd never cashed the check from the share transfer, that she'd donated her entire portion to anonymous charities, he'd told himself it was her choice, her way of making a clean break. He'd built the empire she'd helped start, and she'd chosen to walk away from it. Guilt was easier to ignore when you could frame it as someone else's decision. But now, 5 years later, standing in his office with her invitation in his hand, David realized he'd been lying to himself about everything. She hadn't left because she wanted to. She'd left because he'd made it impossible to stay. And now she'd returned. Not to reclaim what was hers, but to show him what he'd destroyed. At 7:45 p.m., the Bright House Anniversary Gala was in full swing. The ballroom pulsed with light and sound and the self-congratulatory laughter of people who believed they'd earned their place at the top. Champagne flowed like water. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of food that looked like art and tasted like money. A string quartet played something classical and expensive in the corner. David stood near the main stage, nodding at compliments he didn't hear, shaking hands he didn't feel, smiling for cameras that captured everything except the truth. His PR director had briefed him on the speech timing. 7:55, take the stage. 8 o'clock, begin remarks. 8:15, toast to the future. Every minute planned. Every moment choreographed. The perfect celebration of the perfect empire built by the perfect self-made billionaire. Except he kept glancing at the clock. Kept thinking about the Orchid Gallery 10 minutes away. Kept feeling Elena's invitation burning in his jacket pocket like a live coal. "Sir, your speech?" Vanessa prompted, appearing at his elbow with a tablet showing his prepared remarks. "We're 5 minutes out." David looked at the words on the screen. All the right phrases about vision and perseverance and the power of believing in yourself. Nothing about the woman who'd believed in him first. Nothing about the fortune she'd given him. Nothing about how he'd repaid her faith by erasing her from his own story. "Read it for me," he said. Vanessa blinked.
I'm sorry.
"The speech. Read it for me. Tell them I had an emergency. A sudden illness. Anything. Mr. Bright, this is your anniversary gala. 500 guests are expecting you to speak. The board will ask questions. Let them ask." He handed her the tablet, loosened his tie, and walked toward the side exit before she could protest further. Behind him, he heard confused murmurs, the ripple of realization that the guest of honor was leaving his own party. He didn't care. The night air hit him like cold water. His driver started to get out, but David waved him off, choosing instead to walk the 10 blocks to the Orchid Gallery. He needed the movement. Needed the city noise to drown out the voice in his head asking what the hell he was doing. The Orchid Gallery sat on a quiet street in Chelsea, sandwiched between a rare bookstore and a wine bar. Soft light spilled from its windows. A small crowd milled outside, people in casual clothes holding wine glasses and speaking in the hushed tones of art appreciation. No red carpet.
No photographers. No spectacle.
Just art and the people who loved it. David stood across the street for a moment, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked in his $1,000 suit. He'd spent years learning how to move through rooms like he owned them, but this wasn't his world anymore. Maybe it never had been. He crossed the street and pushed open the gallery door. A small bell chimed. The air smelled of varnish and lilies and something else he couldn't name. Something that felt like memory. The crowd was smaller than his gala but somehow louder. Not in volume but in authenticity. Artists and critics and students talked about technique and meaning and emotion. Nobody was here to be seen. They were here to see. On white walls hung canvases washed in golds and shadows, depicting hands in various acts of creation. Hands sketching. Hands shaping clay. Hands building. Hands tearing paper. Hands releasing. Each piece captured motion frozen, potential caught between becoming and unmaking. Beneath each painting, a small brass plate read, EW. At the center of the gallery stood a sculpture that stopped David in his tracks. Bronze, life-size, 2 hands intertwined in a way that looked both intimate and painful. One hand reaching upward, straining toward something just out of reach. The other hand open, palm down, releasing. They were separate but connected, bound by the negative space between them. A placard beside it read, Dedication number 12. To the man who taught me that building without love is just architecture of loneliness. David's throat closed, his vision blurred. Around him, people moved and talked and sipped wine, but he couldn't hear anything except the rush of blood in his ears, and the echo of words he'd said 5 years ago dressed up as wisdom but revealed now as cruelty. Dreams don't belong to the people who watch. They belong to the ones who finish them. He'd finished the dream, built the empire, achieved everything he'd set out to accomplish, and he'd never felt more alone. David! The voice came from behind him, soft,
Familiar.
like hearing his own name for the first time. He turned slowly, afraid that if he moved too fast she'd disappear again. Afraid she was already a ghost he'd conjured from guilt and regret. But Elena Warren stood by the far wall, solid and real and here. She wore a simple cream dress, nothing designer, nothing with a label that mattered.
No diamonds. No guards. No armor.
Just her. Her hair was shorter now, cut to her shoulders and streaked with copper that caught the gallery lights. She looked thinner than he remembered, more weathered, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Calm. The kind that came from surviving a storm and learning you were stronger than the wind. Elena, he managed. His voice cracked on her name. They stood 3 feet apart, the sculpture of intertwined hands between them like a bridge or a barrier or both. You came, she said, not a question, an observation. You knew I would. I hoped. She smiled faintly. Hope is a dangerous thing, but I'm trying to remember how it works. He wanted to say 1,000 things. Wanted to apologize, to explain, to beg forgiveness for every moment he'd chosen ambition over her. But all he could manage was, "You disappeared." "I left," she corrected gently. "There's a difference. You didn't take anything. Not the money, not the shares, nothing. I took myself. That was all I had left to take." The truth of it hit him like a punch. He'd spent 5 years telling himself she'd abandoned him, that she'd walked away from their dream. But she hadn't abandoned anything. She'd escaped, pulled herself out of the wreckage before he crushed her completely. He moved closer to the sculpture, his hand hovering near the bronze. "They're us," he said. "Aren't they?" "They're what we were," Elena replied. "Before we forgot how to hold each other without hurting." "I never meant to hurt you. I know." She stepped beside him, both of them staring at the hands that reached and released. "That's what made it worse. You hurt me with efficiency, with progress, with all the right business reasons that felt like love dying in a boardroom." He flinched.
Elena.
"You wanted to know why I didn't take anything when I left?" She turned to face him fully now, and he saw the cost of these 5 years written in the fine lines around her eyes. "Because taking from you wouldn't give me back what I lost." "What did you lose?" "Myself," she said simply. "I lost myself building your dream. I stopped painting, stopped designing, stopped having opinions that mattered. I became your reflection, your muse, your pretty footnote. And the worst part was I let it happen. I chose you over me so many times that I forgot what I looked like without your shadow." He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to explain that he'd never asked her to disappear. But the words died in his throat because they were lies and they both knew it. "These pieces," he gestured to the walls, to the hands captured in various states of creation and destruction, "they're all about me. They're about what ambition costs," she corrected, "and what it teaches. You weren't the only one who learned something from our ending, David. I learned that you can love someone and still need to leave them. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is save yourself." Around them, the gallery continued its soft hum of appreciation. People discussed technique and symbolism and whether the bronze captured longing or loss or both. None of them knew they were standing in the middle of a confession, a reckoning 5 years in the making. "Congratulations on the gala," Elena said, her voice carefully neutral. "I saw the press coverage. Very impressive." "I left," he admitted. "Walked out in the middle of it to come here." Surprise flickered across her face. "Why?" "Because you invited me. Because I've spent 5 years lying to myself about what I did to you. Because standing in that ballroom accepting praise for an empire you helped build felt like the worst kind of theft." She studied him for a long moment. "You're not here for forgiveness." "No," he said honestly. I don't deserve that. Then why are you here? Because you deserved better than silence. Better than me pretending you never existed. Better than watching me celebrate alone something we built together. Elena nodded slowly, like he'd finally said something true. The empire was never yours alone, David. But it was never mine either. It was ours. And we destroyed it together. I destroyed it, he corrected. You just stopped trying to save something that was already gone. Maybe. She looked back at the sculpture, at the hands forever caught between holding and letting go. Or maybe we both loved the dream more than we loved each other. Maybe that was always going to end badly. The words should have hurt, but instead they felt like release. Like someone finally naming the thing that had haunted him for 5 years. They'd loved the empire more than each other. Fed it with their best selves and watched it devour them both. I'm sorry, he said. For all of it. For taking your shares. For erasing your name. For convincing myself that success justified everything. For making you small so I could feel big. I know, she whispered. I forgave you a long time ago. Not because you deserved it, but because I needed to. He felt something break in his chest. Not his heart. That had broken 5 years ago when she left. This was something deeper. The shell he'd built around the broken pieces. The lie he'd told himself about being complete without her. What do we do now? He asked.
Elena smiled sadly.
We say goodbye properly this time. Without anger or blame or hoping the other person will change. We acknowledge what we were and accept what we became and move forward. That sounds very wise and very lonely. Most wise things are. They stood in silence, two architects of the same ruin, surrounded by art that told the truth neither of them had been brave enough to speak until now. I should get back, David said finally, though he made no move toward the door. The board will be furious. Vanessa probably thinks I'm having a breakdown. Are you? Elena asked. Having a breakdown? He considered it. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just finally seeing clearly. What do you see? He looked at her. Really looked. Saw the woman who'd believed in him when he was nobody. Who'd given him everything and asked for nothing except to be seen. Who'd loved him enough to leave when staying meant losing herself. I see what I lost, he said. I see what I chose instead. And I see that I can't undo any of it. No, she agreed. You can't. But you can choose what you do next. And what should I do next? Elena picked up her wine glass from a nearby table, took a slow sip and met his eyes. Make it worth the cost. Make it worth the cost. The words followed David out of the Orchid Gallery, through the quiet Chelsea streets, back to the gala where 500 people pretended not to notice his absence. They echoed in his head during Vanessa's terse debriefing, during the board members' pointed questions, during the ride home to his penthouse that suddenly felt too large and too empty. Make it worth the cost. He stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan sprawling below him like a kingdom he'd conquered but never learned to rule. Somewhere in that grid of light and shadow, Elena was probably cleaning up her gallery, taking down the pieces that had told their story better than he ever could. His phone buzzed with notifications. Emails from board members demanding explanations. Text messages from Vanessa with damage control strategies. A voicemail from his head of marketing asking if he was all right because the press was already running stories about his mysterious departure. He ignored all of it and opened his laptop instead. Typed her name into the search bar.
Elena Warren.
The results were sparse. A few mentions in art blogs about emerging sculptors. A small feature in a Brooklyn arts magazine about her studio. Nothing about Bright. Nothing about him. She'd built a new life completely separate from the empire they'd created together. But then he found something else. An old interview from 3 years ago. Some grad student's thesis project on women in business. The interviewer had somehow tracked Elena down and convinced her to speak on record. David read the transcript with his heart in his throat. Interviewer. You were a founding partner of Bright House of Design, correct? Elena Warren. I was a partner, yes. Founding feels like too strong a word for someone whose name disappeared from the paperwork. Interviewer. There's very little public information about your role in the company's early years. Why is that? Elena Warren. Because history is written by the people who stay, not the people who leave. And I left. Interviewer. Do you regret that decision? Elena Warren. Every day and never. I regret what I lost. I don't regret choosing myself. Interviewer. If you could go back, what would you do differently? Elena Warren. I'd remember that you can't save someone by drowning with them. I'd learn earlier that love isn't supposed to make you smaller. I'd understand that building an empire means nothing if you lose your soul in the foundation. David closed the laptop, sat in the dark of his penthouse with the weight of her words pressing down on his chest like concrete. She'd been living with this for 3 years, for 5 years, while he'd been collecting awards and giving speeches about vision and perseverance. She'd been rebuilding herself from the ruins he'd left behind. He thought about the sculpture in the gallery, the hands reaching and releasing, one straining upward toward something it could never quite grasp, the other open, palm down, letting go. He'd spent 5 years reaching for more success, more recognition, more proof that he'd been right to prioritize the empire over everything else. And all of it felt like ashes in his mouth because the one person whose opinion mattered wasn't there to see it. Make it worth the cost. But how? How did you make worth out of wreckage? How did you justify destroying something beautiful in the name of building something bigger? The answer came to him at 3 in the morning, sleepless and staring at the ceiling of his bedroom, the room where Elena used to sleep beside him, where they used to plan their future in whispered conversations that felt like prayers, where he'd watched her fade into silence until she wasn't there at all. He couldn't undo what he'd done. Couldn't give her back the years she'd spent invisible. Couldn't return the fortune she'd invested in him or the credit she deserved for building his empire. But he could tell the truth. The next morning, David called an emergency meeting with his legal team. Gregory Thorne, his chief counsel, arrived looking harried and concerned. "Sir, about last night," Gregory began. "The board is asking questions. Your sudden departure raised concerns about your health, your judgment." "Forget last night," David interrupted. "I need you to pull every founding document we have, every contract, every filing, every piece of paper related to the company's formation." Gregory blinked. "That's thousands of pages. May I ask why?" "Because I need to know exactly what Elena Warren contributed to this company. Financial investment, intellectual property, design patents, everything." "Mr. Bright, I'm not sure that's advisable. Dredging up old partnerships could open legal questions we don't want to answer." "I'm not asking for advice, Gregory. I'm asking for documents. Have them on my desk by end of day." Gregory nodded slowly, clearly calculating what this meant. "Of course, sir. Though I should mention that Ms. Warren signed away all rights when she transferred her shares. Legally speaking, she has no claim to anything." "Legally speaking," David repeated. "What about morally speaking?" Gregory had no answer for that. By evening, David's desk was covered in folders and file boxes. The archaeology of an empire. He started at the beginning with the original business plan he and Elena had written together. Her handwriting filled the margins with notes about sustainable sourcing and ethical manufacturing. Principles he'd slowly abandoned as the company grew and shortcuts became necessary. Next came the trademark filings. Elena Warren listed as co-creator on 17 original designs. 17 pieces that had launched Bright into the luxury market. Her name had been on those patents until the consolidation, until he'd convinced her it was temporary. Then the financial records. Her initial investment, $240,000. Her entire inheritance from her grandmother. Money she could have used to travel, to buy a home, to secure her own future. Instead, she'd bet it all on him. The company was now worth $3.7 billion. Even if you calculated conservatively, accounting for risk and market conditions and his own contribution, her original investment would be worth at least $40 million today. $40 million she'd walked away from. David sat back in his chair, the numbers swimming in front of him. She hadn't just given him seed capital. She'd given him her future, and he'd turned it into his empire while she'd ended up painting in a studio apartment. He kept reading, found the intellectual property charter that Gregory had mentioned. The E-line process, a technique Elena had developed for embossing sustainable fabrics with luxury textures. The process that made Bright's signature look possible. The innovation that had separated them from every other luxury brand trying to go green. Her name was still on the patent. 50% ownership through something called the Warren Foundation. He'd never heard of it. David picked up his phone and called Gregory. The Warren Foundation. What is it? Gregory sighed. A non-profit Ms. Warren established during the consolidation. When she transferred her shares, she moved all her intellectual property rights into the foundation. It was her condition for signing. What does that mean? It means that technically, legally, every product we manufacture using the E-line process owes 50% of its value to the foundation. We've been paying royalties into an account for 5 years. David's hand tightened on the phone. How much? Last I checked, north of $20 million. And Elena knows about this? She's listed as the sole director of the foundation, so yes, she'd have to sign off on any distributions. Has she distributed anything? Papers rustled on Gregory's end. Scholarships for art students. Grants for emerging designers. Startup capital for sustainable fashion companies. She's been giving it all away as fast as it accumulates. David set the phone down slowly. She'd found a way to keep what was hers without keeping it for herself. Found a way to make her investment matter without letting it tie her to him. She'd been supporting the next generation of designers while he'd been building monuments to his own ego. Make it worth the cost. She'd already been doing it. For 5 years. While he'd been pretending she didn't exist. That night, David couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the sculpture. The hands building and breaking. The dedication that called his empire architecture of loneliness. She'd seen through him. Seen what success had made him into. And she'd chosen to leave rather than watch him hollow himself out completely. He thought about what she'd said at the gallery. That they'd destroyed the empire together. That loving the dream more than each other had always meant it would end badly. But that wasn't quite true. He'd loved the dream more. She'd loved him. And he'd used that love like currency until she had nothing left to spend. At dawn, he made a decision. The Bright House of Design occupied 15 floors in Midtown Manhattan. Headquarters for an empire that stretched across continents. David arrived early, before any of his staff, and went directly to the archives. The room where they kept the original designs. The sketches that had started everything. He found what he was looking for in a portfolio marked Year 1. Elena's drawings. Her handwriting labeling each piece with notes about fabric and movement and the emotional resonance of color. This was before he'd started editing her work. Before he'd convinced himself he knew better. Her vision had been different from his. Softer. More concerned with how clothes made people feel than how they made people look. She designed for transformation, not transaction. For becoming, not having. He changed all of it. Streamlined her curves into sharp lines. Replaced her flowing silhouettes with structured armor. Turned her invitation into intimidation. Made luxury a wall instead of a door. And it had worked. Made him rich beyond measure. But it had also made him into someone she couldn't recognize. Someone he barely recognized himself. David pulled out his phone and called Vanessa. I need to schedule a press conference, he said. When? Today. This afternoon. Make it happen. What's this about, David? The board is already on edge after the gala incident. Tell them it's an announcement about the company's future. Tell them anything. Just get the press there. Vanessa hesitated. Are you sure you're all right? You've been acting strange since I walked out of my own party to visit my ex-partner who I spent 5 years pretending didn't exist? Yes, Vanessa. I'm aware I've been acting strange. Set up the press conference. He hung up before she could argue. The press conference was scheduled for 3 p.m. in the Bright House main atrium. Cameras and reporters filled the space, all buzzing with speculation. Vanessa stood to the side looking like she might have a stroke. The board members clustered in a corner, whispering among themselves. David stood at the podium, a single folder in front of him. No prepared remarks.
No teleprompter.
Just him and the truth he should have told 5 years ago. The room quieted. Cameras focused. He took a breath. 10 years ago, he began. I started Bright House of Design with a dream of creating something beautiful, something that would last. I've spent the last decade telling the story of how I built this empire from nothing. How vision and hard work and perseverance turned a struggling designer into one of the most recognized names in luxury fashion. He paused, looked directly at the cameras. That story is a lie. The room erupted. Questions shouted. Cameras flashing. Vanessa looked like she might faint. David held up a hand. Not a complete lie, he continued, but a lie of omission. A lie that let me take credit for something I didn't build alone. Bright House of Design was never a solo vision. It was a partnership. A collaboration between myself and Elena Warren. He opened the folder and held up the original business plan, her handwriting visible in the margins. Elena Warren invested her entire inheritance in this company. $240,000 when I had nothing. She designed the first collection that made Bright a name worth knowing. She developed the E-line process that made our sustainable luxury possible. She introduced me to patrons and buyers and critics who took a chance on an unknown designer because she believed in me. David's voice cracked slightly, but he pushed forward. And in return, I slowly erased her from the story, edited her contributions, removed her name from documents, convinced myself that consolidating ownership was good business when really it was just ego. I took an empire we built together and made it mine alone. And when she finally had enough, when she walked away rather than watch herself disappear completely, I let her go. Let the world believe the myth of the self-made billionaire instead of acknowledging the woman who made it all possible. He pulled out another document. The Warren Foundation Charter. Elena Warren owns 50% of the intellectual property that makes Bright profitable. She has for 5 years. Instead of using that to take what she deserved, she created a foundation that supports emerging designers, that gives scholarships to art students, that invests in sustainable fashion startups. She's been building what I should have built, what we promised to build when we started. A company with a soul. The room was silent now, every person transfixed. So here's what's going to happen, David said. Effective immediately, Bright House of Design will redirect 50% of all profits to the Warren Foundation, not as charity, as restitution, as payment for the empire Elena helped build and the credit I stole. Every product we sell, every contract we sign, every dollar we earn, half goes to continuing her vision of what this company was supposed to be. Chaos erupted. Board members shouting. Reporters calling questions. Vanessa making frantic phone calls. David simply stepped away from the podium and walked out of the building. His phone rang within minutes. Gregory, then board members, then investors. Everyone demanding to know what he was thinking. How he could make such a decision without consultation. Whether he'd lost his mind. He ignored them all and called a car. Gave the driver an address in Brooklyn. Sat in the back seat watching the city slide past and felt lighter than he had in years. Elena's studio was in a converted warehouse near the waterfront. David climbed 3 flights of stairs and knocked on a paint-stained door. No answer. He knocked again. "It's open," came her voice from inside. He pushed through and found her at an easel, working on a canvas that looked like hands dissolving into light. She didn't turn around. "I saw your press conference," she said. "It's trending on every platform. Your board is in meltdown. Stock dropped 6%. I know. You just cost yourself hundreds of millions of dollars. I know." She set down her brush and finally turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable. "Why?" she asked. "Because you told me to make it worth the cost. Because I couldn't live with the lie anymore. Because you deserve to have your name attached to what we built, even if you don't want it." Elena studied him for a long moment. "You think this fixes things?" "No," David said honestly. "Nothing fixes this. but it's a start toward truth, toward acknowledging what I took from you, toward building something that actually matters instead of just making me rich. The board will fight you. Let them. I still control voting shares. They can be angry, but they can't stop me. And if the company collapses, if investors pull out, then it collapses, he said. Better that than continuing to profit from your work while pretending you never existed. She walked to the window, looked out at the East River glittering in the afternoon sun. You can't buy forgiveness, David. I'm not trying to. I'm trying to do the right thing, even if it's 5 years too late. The right thing, she repeated. Do you even know what that is anymore? No, he admitted. But I'm trying to learn. Elena turned back to him, and something in her expression softened slightly. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but maybe the beginning of understanding. The foundation works because it's separate from Bright, she said, because it's not about profit or market share or building empires. It's about giving people the chance I gave you, the chance to create something beautiful without compromising everything they are. I know. That's why I'm not asking to be involved. The money goes to you, to the foundation, to whatever vision you have. I'm just the checkbook. Just the checkbook, she echoed with a faint smile. That's a first. I'm learning humility. It's painful and I'm bad at it, but I'm trying. She laughed, actually laughed. The sound filled her small studio like light through a prism. You really are terrible at it, she said. Even your humility is dramatic. I'm a work in progress. Aren't we all? They stood in her studio, two people who'd once finished each other's sentences now struggling to complete a single thought. But it felt different than the gallery. Less loaded. More like two strangers finding their footing. Thank you, Elena said finally, for the press conference, for telling the truth, for not making me fight for what was mine. You shouldn't have to thank me for basic decency. Maybe not. But I'm still grateful. David nodded, started to leave, stopped at the door.
Elena.
Yes. The sculpture. The hands. Is there any chance it's for sale? She looked surprised. Why would you want it? Because it's the truth, he said. Because I need to remember what it costs to build without love. Because maybe if I look at it every day, I'll become someone who deserves to. Elena considered this. It's not for sale, but I'll loan it to you, indefinitely, with one condition. What's that? Put it in your office, where every decision you make has to pass by those hands first, where you can't forget what you're building on. Deal. The weeks that followed were chaos. Board meetings where members threatened resignation. Investor calls where analysts questioned his judgment. Press coverage that ranged from inspired to insane. The stock price fluctuated wildly. Some praised his transparency. Others called it career suicide. David weathered it all with a strange sense of calm. The sculpture sat in his office now, bronze hands forever reaching and releasing. He looked at it before every decision, consulted it like an oracle, asked himself what Elena would say, whether this choice was building something real or just building another monument to his own ego. The Warren Foundation flourished with the influx of capital. Elena hired staff, expanded programs, funded a generation of designers who might never have gotten their chance. David watched from a distance, received quarterly reports, signed checks without comment. They didn't speak often. Occasional emails about foundation business. A brief conversation at a charity event where they were both invited. It was professional, cordial, nothing like what they'd been and everything like what they'd become. But 6 months after the press conference, Elena called him. I have something to show you, she said. Can you come to the foundation? The Warren Foundation for Emerging Designers had moved into a renovated warehouse in downtown Brooklyn. Murals covered the brick walls. Faces of unknown designers. Colors bleeding into one another like forgiveness made visible. Young artists moved through the space with the kind of hungry optimism David remembered from his early days. Elena met him in the lobby. She looked different, lighter, like someone who'd put down a weight she'd been carrying for years. Welcome, she said. Want the tour? She walked him through studios where designers worked on sustainable collections, past classrooms where students learned the business side of fashion, through galleries where emerging artists displayed their work without compromise. This is what I wanted Bright to be, Elena said. Not a luxury brand. Community. A place where creation mattered more than commerce. Where people could make beautiful things without losing themselves. It's incredible, David said honestly. You built this. We built it, she corrected. Your money made it possible. My vision gave it purpose. That's what partnership actually looks like. They stopped in front of a wall covered in photographs. Young designers holding their first collections. Students receiving scholarships. Artists at their exhibitions. Every face beaming with the kind of joy that came from being seen. From being given a chance. There's someone I want you to meet, Elena said. She led him to a studio where a young woman worked on a dress made from recycled materials. The silhouette was familiar. Soft curves. Flowing lines. The kind of design Elena used to make before David had edited her vision into something sharper. This is Jasmine Okafor, Elena introduced. One of our first scholarship recipients. She's launching her debut collection next month. Jasmine looked up, starstruck. You're David Bright. I am. Your work is beautiful. Thank you. But honestly, Elena's the reason I'm here. She saw my portfolio when I was working 3 jobs trying to afford fabric. Gave me a scholarship. Studio space. Actually listened to my ideas instead of trying to make me into something I'm not. The words landed like a gentle accusation. David smiled anyway. That's what she does best, he said. Sees potential and lets it grow into what it's meant to be. After the tour, Elena walked him back to the entrance. The sun was setting, painting the warehouse windows gold. Why did you really call me here? David asked. You could have sent photos. Didn't need to show me in person. Elena leaned against the brick wall, considering her answer. Because I wanted you to see what your money is building. Not another empire with your name on it. Real things that matter to real people. I wanted you to see that maybe, possibly, you're learning what it means to build with love instead of just ambition. Am I? Learning? I don't know yet, but you're trying. That counts for something. Does it count for forgiveness? She smiled sadly. David, I forgave you a long time ago. What you're waiting for isn't my forgiveness. It's your own. The truth of it hit him square in the chest. He'd spent 6 months making amends, writing checks, telling the truth, thinking that if he performed enough penance Elena would absolve him. But she already had. The work that remained was his alone. I don't know how to forgive myself, he admitted. Start by becoming someone who deserves it. Keep supporting this foundation. Keep telling the truth about who built your empire. Keep choosing people over profit. Do it long enough and maybe one day you'll look in the mirror and recognize who's staring back. And if I never do, if I'm always the man who hurt you, then you're always that man, she said gently. But you can also be the man who tried to do better. Who used his power to lift others up instead of himself. Who learned, finally, that building without love is just architecture of loneliness. She pushed off the wall, preparing to go back inside. David caught her arm. Elena, wait. Do you ever think about what we could have been? If I'd been different? If we'd actually been partners instead of me taking over? She looked at his hand on her arm, then at his face. Every day for the first 3 years. Once a month for the next 2. Now? Hardly ever. Not because I don't care about what we were, but because I'm too busy building what I am. Do you think we'll ever be friends again? I think we're colleagues who share a complicated history. Maybe that's enough. Maybe it has to be. She gently removed his hand. Thank you for coming today. And David, keep trying. You're not there yet, but you're moving in the right direction. She went inside, leaving him standing on the street as the sun disappeared behind the Brooklyn skyline. 1 year after the press conference, David Bright resigned as CEO of Bright House of Design. He stayed on as creative director, focusing on design instead of business operations. He sold his penthouse and moved into a smaller apartment in the West Village. Started mentoring young designers through the Warren Foundation. Spent less time at galas and more time at student exhibitions. The company didn't collapse. Stock stabilized. A new CEO with a background in sustainable fashion took over operations. The foundation partnership became Bright's defining characteristic. What could have destroyed the brand instead gave it new purpose. David kept the sculpture in his office. Looked at those bronze hands every day. Asked himself if he was building or breaking. If he was reaching for something real or just reaching. He and Elena communicated regularly now. Professional emails about foundation business. Occasional coffees to discuss new programs. They weren't friends, not really, but they'd found a kind of peace in their professional relationship. A way to coexist that didn't require them to rehash the past. 2 years after the press conference, the Warren Foundation held its annual gala. A celebration of the designers they'd supported, the scholarships they'd awarded, the change they'd made in an industry that usually valued profit over people. David attended but stayed in the background. Let Elena have the spotlight. Watched her give a speech about creativity and community and the importance of building things that mattered. She was brilliant, radiant, free of the shadow he'd once cast over her. During the reception, a young designer approached him. "Mr. Bright? I just wanted to thank you. Your foundation scholarship changed my life." "It's not my foundation," David corrected gently. "It's Elena's. I just help fund it." "Still, what you did, being honest about whose work built your company, it meant a lot. Made me believe that maybe the fashion industry could be different." After the designer left, Elena appeared beside him. "You're still doing that," she observed. "Doing what?" "Deflecting credit. Trying to give everything to me. Because you deserve it. And you're learning to share recognition instead of hoarding it. That's growth, David." They stood together, watching the party swirl around them. Young designers networking. Students presenting their work. A community built on the ruins of what they'd destroyed. "Do you ever regret it?" David asked. "Leaving when you did? Walking away from Bright?" Elena considered the question. "I regret that it had to happen. That we couldn't find a way to grow together instead of apart. But I don't regret choosing myself. That choice saved my life. I'm glad you did. Even though it cost me everything." "It didn't cost you everything. You still have your empire. The empire doesn't mean anything without people to share it with." She smiled. "Look at you. Finding wisdom in your old age." "I'm 39. Ancient," she teased. For a moment they just stood there. Not uncomfortable. Not painful. Just two people who'd known each other once and were learning to know each other again in a different way. "I should circulate," Elena said. "Donors to thank. Artists to introduce. Of course. This is your night." She started to walk away, then turned back. "David? Thank you. For funding the foundation. For telling the truth. For letting me build something real from the pieces. It matters." "You're welcome. And Elena? Thank you for not giving up on the dream, even after I ruined our version of it. You built something better." "We built something better," she corrected. "Different than before, but maybe that's how it was supposed to be." She disappeared into the crowd, and David felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, not redemption, but something close to peace. The knowledge that he'd done what he could to make amends. That he couldn't change the past, but he could shape what came next. He looked around at the gala. The young designers laughing and showing their work. The students meeting their heroes. The community that had grown from the foundation Elena built with the money he should have given her years ago. This was his legacy now. Not the luxury empire with his name on it. But this, people given chances. Talent given space to grow. Beauty created without compromise. Architecture with a soul. 3 years after the press conference, a glossy magazine ran a feature titled The Redemption of Bright. The article traced David's journey from celebrated CEO to, as they put it, reformed egomaniac learning humility. It interviewed Elena at length, featured photos of the Warren Foundation, discussed the unusual partnership between a luxury brand and a nonprofit. The last paragraph read, "Sometimes greatness is not in what we create, but in what we return." David Bright spent 10 years building an empire on someone else's foundation. He spent the last 3 years trying to give it back. Whether that's enough remains to be seen. But in an industry obsessed with taking credit, his willingness to share it might be the most revolutionary thing he's ever designed. David clipped the article and sent it to the foundation's address with a short note written in his own hand. "You were right. Building without love is just architecture of loneliness. Thank you for teaching me what matters, even if I had to lose everything to learn it." Elena never replied directly, but the next month, a new exhibition opened at a gallery in Chelsea. A series of paintings called Reconstruction, images of hands building, not alone this time, hands working together, creating something new from broken pieces. The dedication plaque read, "For DS, who learned that some things must break before they can be rebuilt right. May we all have the courage to start over." David attended the opening, stood in front of those paintings for hours, saw himself in those hands, saw Elena, saw what they'd been and what they'd become and what they might someday manage to build if they kept choosing honesty over ego. A young couple stood beside him, holding hands, looking at the paintings with the kind of dreamy optimism he remembered. "It's about second chances," the woman said to her partner. "About how beautiful things can come from broken places." "Is it though?" the man replied. "Or is it about accepting that some things stay broken and learning to build around the cracks?" "Maybe it's both," the woman said. David smiled. Maybe it was both. 5 years after the press conference, David Bright attended Elena Warren's wedding. She married another artist, someone who understood her need for creation and space and the freedom to remain fully herself. Someone who saw her first as Elena, not as a reflection or a muse or a stepping stone to empire. David sat in the back row, watched her walk down the aisle in a dress she'd designed herself. Soft curves, flowing lines. Exactly the kind of thing she used to make before he'd convinced her to change. She looked happy, whole, like someone who'd survived a storm and learned she was stronger than the wind. After the ceremony, at the reception, she found him. "You came," she said. "Of course. Wouldn't miss it."
I'm glad.
She looked at her new husband across the room. "He's good for me. Reminds me who I am when I forget. That's what love should do." She studied David's face. "Are you happy? Really happy?" He considered the question. Thought about his smaller apartment, his mentoring work, the foundation that bore her name but ran on his guilt and his hope for something better, the empire he'd built and learned to share. "I'm becoming happy," he said, "learning what it means. You were right about everything. The empire wasn't worth the cost. But maybe the lesson was." "Maybe," she agreed. "Or maybe we just tell ourselves that so the pain means something. Probably both." She laughed. "Always both with us." Her new husband called to her. Time for the first dance. Elena squeezed David's hand. "Thank you," she said, "for the foundation funding, for the truth, for letting me go when I needed to be let go, for learning to build something real instead of just something big. Thank you for seeing me when I was nobody, for believing in the dream even after I destroyed it, for teaching me that some things matter more than success. We taught each other," she said. "That's what partnerships do." She walked away to dance with her new husband. David watched for a moment, then slipped out into the garden. The night air was cool and clear, stars visible despite the city lights. He thought about the sculpture in his office, the hands reaching and releasing, forever caught between building and breaking. He'd spent 5 years learning to release, to let go of the myth he'd built, to share credit, to fund Elena's vision without demanding ownership of it, to become someone who built with love instead of just ambition. It hadn't made him happier in the simple sense, hadn't filled the empty spaces or erased the guilt or given him back what he'd lost, but it had made him real, given him a purpose beyond profit, taught him that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is acknowledge you were wrong and spend the rest of your life trying to make it right. He would never get Elena back, would never rebuild what they'd had. That ship had sailed, burned, and sunk. But he could keep supporting the foundation, keep mentoring young designers, keep choosing people over profit, keep building things that mattered, keep learning what love actually meant. Not possession, not transaction, but the freedom to let someone be fully themselves, even if that meant letting them go. Especially if that meant letting them go. David walked back inside. The reception was in full swing. Elena danced with her husband, laughing at something he said. Young artists and designers filled the room. People Elena had helped. People the foundation had given chances to. A community built on the principles she'd tried to teach him years ago. He didn't belong here. Not really. This was her world now. Her life rebuilt without him. But he'd been invited, welcomed, given a place at the edge of her new beginning. That was enough. That had to be enough. As the night drew to a close, as guests began to leave, Elena found him one more time. "Drive safe," she said. "And David? Keep going. You're not done yet." Done with what? Becoming someone you can forgive. Someone who deserves the second chance you've been given. Will I ever get there? Deserve it? She smiled, sad and warm and honest. "I don't know, but watching you try is the best thing that's come from everything we destroyed." She kissed his cheek. A brief touch, a blessing or a goodbye or both. Then she was gone, back to her husband and her new life and the future she'd built from the ashes of their past. David drove home through the quiet streets, thought about hands building and breaking, about partnerships that ended and new beginnings that grew from the ruins. About how sometimes love meant losing everything and learning to be grateful for the lesson. He'd spent 10 years building an empire, 5 years learning to dismantle it. And now he had the rest of his life to build something that actually mattered. Not luxury, not success, not monuments to his own genius. Just honest work, just support for people who needed it, just the daily choice to be better than he was yesterday. The sculpture still sat in his office, would sit there for the rest of his career, a reminder of what ambition cost, of whose hands built his dream, of the woman who'd loved him enough to invest everything and brave enough to walk away when staying meant losing herself. Some empires were built on steel and stone. His was built on borrowed dreams and returned credit, on acknowledging debt and paying it forward, on learning, finally, that greatness wasn't measured in what you accumulated but in what you gave back. In the end, neither fortune nor fame proved lasting. The bright name would fade eventually. The luxury empire would be sold or transformed or forgotten. But the Warren Foundation would continue. The designers it supported would create. The students it funded would build their own dreams. That was legacy. Not buildings with his name carved in marble. But lives changed. Chances given. Beauty created without compromise. Elena had taught him that. Terrible cost. Through painful lessons. By leaving when he wouldn't listen and forgiving when he finally learned. He couldn't change the past. Couldn't give her back the years she'd spent invisible. Couldn't undo the empire he'd built on her sacrifice. But he could spend the rest of his life making sure no other designer had to choose between their vision and their survival. Making sure no other creative soul had to disappear to make room for someone else's ego. That was his penance, his purpose, his path to something that might someday resemble redemption. David pulled into his apartment building, took the elevator to his modest floor, unlocked the door to rooms that didn't echo with emptiness anymore, because he'd learned to fill them with purpose instead of possessions. On his desk sat a letter that had arrived that morning. Foundation letterhead. He opened it carefully. "Dear David," it read in Elena's handwriting. The board voted to rename the foundation. They wanted to call it the Bright Warren Foundation, to acknowledge both our contributions. I told them no, not because I don't appreciate what you've done, but because some things need to remain separate to remain pure. Your money funds the work. My vision guides it. That's the partnership that works now. The one where we both get to be whole. Thank you for understanding. Thank you for respecting boundaries. Thank you for learning what I tried to teach you 10 years too late. It matters. You matter. Not because of what you built, but because of what you're trying to rebuild. Keep going.
Elena.
David read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in a frame beside the magazine article. Small monuments to failure and learning, to breaking and rebuilding, to the long, hard work of becoming someone worthy of forgiveness. His phone buzzed. A message from one of his ments, a young designer who'd just landed her first major contract. She was thanking him for his advice, for his support, for believing in her vision even when buyers wanted her to compromise. He typed back, "The credit isn't mine. It's Elena's. She taught me that the best thing we can build is each other. Pass it forward." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, a response. "I will. Thank you for learning that lesson and teaching it to me." David set his phone down, looked around his apartment, at the sketches from his ments on his walls, at the foundation reports on his coffee table, at the life he'd built after his empire had stopped being enough. It wasn't the life he'd imagined at 25. Wasn't the success story magazines loved. Wasn't the fairy tale where the hero got everything he wanted and the girl too. But it was real. Built on truth instead of myth, on shared credit instead of stolen glory, on the daily choice to be better than the man he'd been. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. 10 years from now, someone would write his obituary. They would mention Bright House of Design, the luxury empire, the dramatic press conference where he'd confessed to erasing his partner, the foundation that bore her name and ran on his guilt transformed into purpose. They would call it redemption, or they would call it penance, or they would call it too little too late. History would judge. Critics would debate. None of it would matter as much as this single truth. He had hurt someone he loved, built an empire on her sacrifice. And when he finally understood what he'd done, he'd spent the rest of his life trying to make it right. Not for glory, not for credit, not even for forgiveness, but because it was the right thing to do. Because Elena deserved better. Because the designers who came after deserved not to repeat his mistakes. Because building without love was just architecture of loneliness, and he'd learned that lesson in the hardest way possible. That was his legacy. Not the buildings or the brand or the billions, but the choice made daily to be better, to build with love, to remember whose hands made his dream possible and to honor those hands by lifting others up. Elena had given him that gift. Not by staying, by leaving, by showing him what it looked like to choose yourself over someone else's dream, by forgiving him without absolving him, by letting him fund her vision without claiming ownership of it. She taught him the difference between partnership and possession, between love and transaction, between building together and building on top of someone until they disappeared. The lesson had cost him everything, cost her more, but maybe, in the end, they'd both found something worth having. She'd found herself again. He'd found a purpose beyond profit. And in the space between what they'd been and what they'd become, in the careful distance of professional respect and honest accounting, they'd built something neither could have made alone. Not an empire, not a love story, but a truth, about cost and creation, about breaking and rebuilding, about how sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is admit you were wrong and spend your life proving you've learned better. David stood and walked to his window. The city sparkled below. Thousands of lights, millions of dreams. Some would succeed, some would fail. Some would succeed at terrible cost and have to learn what he'd learned. That you can have everything and nothing at the same time. That an empire built on someone else's silence is just a tomb with your name on it. That love isn't about possession or transaction or making someone small so you can feel big. Love is the freedom to let someone be fully themselves, even if it means letting them go, especially if it means letting them go. He'd learned that, finally, terrible cost, but he'd learned it, and every day, with every choice to fund another scholarship, mentor another designer, share credit instead of hoarding it, he proved that the lesson had taken root. That was enough. That had to be enough. Somewhere across the city, Elena was dancing at her wedding reception, building a new life with someone who'd never tried to make her smaller. who saw her as Elena first, partner second, never muse or reflection or footnote. David raised his glass to the window, to the woman who'd saved him by leaving, who'd taught him what mattered by showing him what he'd destroyed, who'd given him a second chance not by forgiving him but by letting him try to deserve forgiveness. "Thank you," he whispered to the city lights, "for everything, even the breaking, especially the breaking, because some things had to shatter before you could see what you'd built them on. Some empires had to crumble before you learned what was worth saving. Some loves had to end before you understood what love actually meant." He'd built an empire on borrowed dreams, spent years learning to give them back, and found, in that daily practice of returning credit and sharing success and building with love instead of on top of it, something that felt almost like peace. Not happiness, not redemption, but purpose. The knowledge that he'd done what he could to make amends. That he couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future. That every designer he mentored, every scholarship the foundation funded, every young artist given a chance without having to compromise everything they were, was a brick in a different kind of empire. One with a soul. One built on love instead of loneliness. One that would outlast his name because it wasn't about him at all. That was Elena's gift, her lesson, her legacy in him. And he would spend the rest of his life proving he'd finally learned it. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to Mr. Ellington Love Lines for more powerful stories about love, forgiveness, and finding your way home. Share in the comments if you believe in second chances, and remember, it's never too late to tell the truth about whose hands built your dreams. Sometimes the biggest success stories are actually stories of failure transformed into purpose. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is acknowledge whose work made yours possible. And sometimes, just sometimes, losing everything teaches you what actually matters. David Bright built an empire on Elena Warren's fortune and forgot to say thank you. He spent 10 years celebrated as a self-made billionaire. 5 years learning he was anything but, and the rest of his life trying to rebuild not what he'd lost, but what he should have been all along. Partner, a supporter, a builder who remembered that empires mean nothing if they're built on someone else's erasure. That's the power of truth, the weight of accountability, the long, hard work of becoming someone worthy of the second chances you've been given. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Until next time, this is Mr. Ellington Love Lines, reminding you that your story isn't over yet. The best chapters might be the ones where you admit you were wrong and spend your life proving you've learned better. And sometimes, the ending you never saw coming is exactly the lesson you needed to learn. In the end, neither fortune nor fame proved lasting. What endured was the quiet dignity of accountability, the courage to return what was never truly yours. Forgiveness didn't rebuild their love, but it rebuilt their humanity. And in that rebuilding, in that daily choice to be better, to build with love instead of on top of it, they both found something worth more than any empire. Peace, purpose, the knowledge that some things, once broken, stay broken. But from those broken pieces, if you're brave enough to acknowledge the damage and humble enough to make amends, you can build something new, something real, something that matters. That's the architecture of love. Not monuments to ego, but foundations strong enough to support someone else's dreams. Walls that protect instead of confine. Windows that let in light instead of reflecting only yourself. David Bright learned that lesson 5 years too late. But he learned it. And in the learning, in the trying, in the daily practice of being better than he was, he became someone Elena could respect if not love. Someone who understood that building without soul is just loneliness with a better address. That's his legacy. Not the empire, but the lesson, the truth. The acknowledgement that some hands build and some hands break and the wisest hands learn to do both with equal care. Mr. Ellington Love Lines. Where every heartbreak becomes a heartbeat again.